Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy Everett, your co-host. I'm here with our host, Dr. Greg Miller, and we have a very special guest on the line with us today, Greg. The director, the clinical director of Faithful and True, Jim Farm. Jim, how are you this afternoon?
I am doing good. It's great to be back with you guys on the show today. Thanks for having me.
And thanks for making time and being willing to call in and be a part of the podcast.
Yeah, it's exciting for us. We've been looking forward to part 2 of this conversation about the stages of recovery. Stage 1, you and Greg a few weeks ago launched the first part of this, and today we will try to wrap it up with part 2.
Yeah, and just to remind the listening audience that stage 1 in this process is a time of chaos. And so we're going to be talking about the shattering and shifting. This really is the early days of recovery when someone has been exposed. Everyone's trying to do triage. You're trying to figure out how to find some balance again and be able to move forward. So as we continue on, we're going to be talking about the importance of the couples work. And in that, it's what we refer to as the three-legged stool, where each person is responsible for beginning their work in recovery. And also we begin to understand the importance of couples work. So the man's doing his recovery and getting support. The wife is doing her recovery, getting support. And also in time, they begin to work on the coupleship.
Yeah, Greg, oftentimes when we think about the three-legged stool, it's almost, when I communicate to couples, it's almost like we have to keep focused that we have 3 different recoveries going on that are kind of intermixed, and sometimes, we may forget about that couples piece because there's a lot of pain early on, but, there's a lot of work and vision that we can do within in stabilizing the couple early in the first stage of recovery. And I think that's what we're looking at when we talk about that three-legged stool early on for the couple's leg.
Absolutely. And in fact, early on for the wife, many times the work that she is doing is really about being able to navigate the chaos and the pain that the disclosure or the exposure of the information is creating. It's really about that creating stability in that moment for her. And then for the coupleship, early on, there may not be the capacity to work on the marriage or focus on the marriage. So this early stage is simply finding enough safety for the couple to develop a plan of how to move forward, whether it's together or separate. But in some way, if the coupleship isn't acknowledged or incorporated into the recovery, it will be difficult for them to move forward.
Yeah, and I think it's so important at this stage, Greg, because there's oftentimes a lot of couples are just confused of where to go, what to do at this point, and so to get some early help for the couple, I think is a really important thing. That doesn't necessarily mean we're going to do traditional couples therapy,
Right.
and we wouldn't do that right away. But it is important for both spouses to really kind of hear what's the process, what's the plan to begin this stage of recovery as a couple. What are the next steps for us?
Absolutely. Well, and part of it is in the early days of the recovery. Part of what is needed is the ability to understand all that has happened and all that is going on. It's kind of like, I like images, and it's like a storm has come through and has been incredibly destructive, and it takes a couple of days to identify what all the storm damage is. Immediately, you can't know the long-term implications of the storm. And so in the early days, you're really just doing assessing of what is going on, what has gone on, and what are the current implications of that. And as you've identified, if we rush too quickly to traditional couple counseling, it may not be time, may not be enough safety, and there may not be enough truth and information of what is going on.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think both of us could share stories where we have a couple come in and they've done the couples therapy, but they haven't. Maybe somebody hasn't helped them to identify really what's happened in terms of their addiction, and so it can almost be destructive for the couple to start traditional couples therapy without actually addressing some of the things that are happening from the addiction standpoint and the betrayal aspect.
In some of the stories that we do hear of how injury was done because a couple was moved too quickly to trying to address issues in a long-term strategy and to recommit to each other. And it just needs some space to be exposed all that is going on.
When do you identify that time, Greg?
I think that it depends on the couple. I think it depends upon the circumstance. I think it depends upon how much deception there's been, and even the nature of the acting out. And each person's going to respond differently. But I think the kind of the system that we use is we wait until the spouse is ready for that. So we may encourage some early sessions where the two of them are in a room together simply to try to identify how they are going to function as a couple. But it may be some time before they're able to really start working on the coupleship. But most of that has to do with the spouse is ready to engage that process. Okay. The good news is she can begin to get the support that she needs, even if she's not ready to fully engage the coupleship. He's getting some of the support that he needs. And in fact, she may need to watch for a little bit to make sure that he's committed to his own recovery before she would be willing to maybe be open to the possibility of some sort of reconciliation or movement forward.
Yeah, and I would say as well, Greg. One of the things that sometimes we'll hear with some spouses is that hey, I didn't get us here,
right.
That this is his issue. And one of the things I often will tell spouses in that situation is, there's truth to that maybe that's not what got you into the door, and there is a sense of unfairness about that I have to do this, but it's also an invitation that regardless of how we got here, it's an invitation that I can start to work on self-awareness and personal growth for myself.
Right. Well, and I think for a lot of spouses, what they're wanting in the early days, however they define that, is simply for people to validate the pain and the chaos that they're experiencing. And the rush to reconciliation many times can dismiss that or minimize that pain. And so really creating some openness and space for her to be able to be heard about her pain, the chaos of the betrayal, the chaos of the deception is going to be an important part for her down the road to be able to reconcile. And one of the things that we see is even in her own enthusiasm, sometimes wives will want to immediately forgive and immediately start working towards reconciliation. At some point, whatever issues weren't addressed early on will surface again. And so a lot of times in almost a pattern of avoidance, she may not want to look at some things and feel that pain that her husband has caused. And so we're going to want to encourage her to do that because we know at some point it will surface in some way.
Yeah. And I think that brings us kind of to the next thing that, we wanted to talk about in terms of this first stage is one of the important things, for both spouses to do is to develop a sense of safe community for themselves, because oftentimes we'll see is both spouses are in a lot of pain and oftentimes a lot of shame as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so they'll often feel like, that, no one gets this and I couldn't share this with anybody, But being able to enter into a community of other people, other wives or spouses that are going through this, really starts to diminish some of that shame because they're hearing stories from other wives or, in the case of the men, other guys who are, early in recovery from addiction or maybe even further along in this process. That, they can share things that they would have never imagined, sharing with anyone ever before. And now they're beginning to have a safe community in which they can start to open up about what's happening in their lives.
Well, and you kind of alluded to this. One of the things that helps to create safety is understanding. So we want there to be an education around addiction. We want it to be a group that gets what addiction is because that understanding does help to create safety. One of the things that we teach at the workshop is part of a safe community is where there is no judgment. And if we don't have understanding that it's easy for us to go into some sort of judgment about what someone's decisions were or the choices that they made, I often talk about the fact that a principle of community is if I had lived your life and experienced what you've experienced, I might have made the very same choices that you've made. And if you had lived my life and experienced what I've experienced, you might have made the very same choices I've made. I have no way of telling you I could have lived your life better than you have. And suddenly there's just a freedom there where I'm not there to judge someone else's experience. And another principle, you hear in recovery communities is don't compare, identify. And one of the ways our shame can get triggered or our self-righteousness is by comparing to see whose story is worse or whose story is better. And in doing that, it knocks us out of the truth of our own story. And so that sense of safety that comes from understanding and no judgment is so important in the early days of recovery.
Yeah, it really is, and oftentimes the couples we work with, that they come into our offices with not having so much community, and so oftentimes especially spouses, they're looking at the person that they may have shared with as now has been kind of the source of their pain, and so now they're really feeling alone and with that. And obviously, for the man or the husband that we're working with the addiction, it's hard to approach your wife with the shame or the pain that he's experiencing because she's not available and she's so stuck in her own hurt and experiencing a lot of pain as a result of the betrayal that we really need to start to create that safe community that we can access apart from our spouse.
Right. And what's interesting is we can tell when we're working with individuals how much support they're getting from community. For the spouse that has been alone and isolated, if they find that community piece, it's amazing how things begin to shift. And it's the same thing with the men that we work with. One of the great things about the workshop that we do is that when men come, and for some of them it may be the first time that they're experiencing that level of community, and kind of like what you've said, they are reminded, I'm not alone. Our isolation teaches us the lie that we're the only ones that have ever done this, nobody else would ever understand. And so community is an experiential way to begin to recognize I'm not alone in this, and there are people who can understand.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that you share at the workshop, Greg, is that one of those core beliefs of shame that if you really knew me, you wouldn't accept me or love me, right? And the group provides that environment in which I can allow myself to be fully known. And in the process of that, I actually still experience that acceptance.
Right. Another thing that we teach at the workshop is that a safe community is a place where I'm not going to be rejected. Most of us at various points in our lives, we have experienced rejection. We've been criticized and judged and excluded. And so when we can find that safe place where someone is not going to reject us, it creates this opportunity for vulnerability, which then will create a space for transformation. And that rejection piece is significant because part of the message is your story is not too much for us. Again, like you said, that's our fear that if people knew us, we would be alone. So when we can find a community that can welcome all of us, our story's not too much for them. Another piece of this is there may be times when others need to be brought onto our recovery team. We do that a lot here at Faithful and True, where maybe there's specific work around trauma, or maybe there's some support that they're needing around sexual integration. Well, we can refer out, we can recommend other resources, but we're going to partner with them. It's not like rejecting them and sending them someplace else. It's supporting them as they get the resources that they need for their team.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right, because when we think about those early stages of recovery, we do have to look at things, neurochemistry type stuff. If there's mental health issues like anxiety, ADHD, depression, those are common things. Post-traumatic stress disorder, those are things that we commonly see with a lot of folks that come in to see us initially. And sometimes, we may be equipped to work with some of those, but at other times, and quite often, we need to refer either to a psychiatrist or someone that specializes in trauma work to specifically address some of those things.
Well, and one of the principles, I think, of healthy providing care is this principle of know what you don't know, and know when to refer. No one is going to be able to provide all of the resources that you need in your recovery. And so having those wise voices that can recognize what they're able to do and what their limits are. One of the, I tell this story often where I'm always thankful for Beth's therapist, because in the early days of our recovery, she clearly understood that the sexual addiction piece wasn't her specialty. But she didn't abandon Beth. She supported Beth as Beth reached out and found other resources. And it was in that process that Beth found faithful and true. So, as people who provide care and people who need care, we are served when we recognize our limits and we bring other people on the team when we recognize that someone needs additional support or guidance.
Yeah. I agree with you on that, Greg.
Another thing about safety in community is I like to talk about the fact that safe community isn't shocked by us. So there's no shock. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where someone was telling their story and they're used to people being shocked by what they're saying. And so there's a freedom that comes when they recognize that the men in the experience or the women in their experience aren't shocked by what they're sharing. I mean, we see this in the communities that we lead, but a lot of times people have so much shame about what they've done and the consequences of that and the experiences that they've had that they're used to people having this strong reaction. And one of the benefits of the fact that at Faithful and True, this is our field, men who struggle with sexual addiction and their spouses, by now we've heard so many stories, we're not shocked by that. There's a comfort that comes when, as the professional provider of care, when we can provide assurance that we've heard this before, we can handle this, we've been there, we get it, there's a comfort that comes from that.
Yeah. I know you share this at the workshop, and I think it's one of the more powerful things that you often say at the workshop is, is this concept that most of us are comfortable sharing, a percentage of our story, but it's that 1%, or that percentage that we are most ashamed about, that we really, hold back about. But that percentage that we're holding back is really key to our recovery, because once we're able to start to share that with safe people and we get, a validating response for that, it's encouraging to continue to, let ourselves be known and be able to move forward in the recovery process.
Yeah, and that last 10% that we don't share, there's a voice in our head that's saying, this is too much. That they can handle this, but this detail or this aspect of it is too much. And that shame is what sends us back into secrecy. The counseling center that I went to in my own recovery, the phrase that they used is, the stuff that you don't talk about the most is the stuff that defines you the most. So even if it's just the last 10%, that 10% secrecy has a significant power. And it may take some time. I often tell the men, we recognize it may take some time for you to feel safe enough to bring all of your story here. And we want you to know that this is a safe place for it, that whatever the rest of that is, we're able to be with you in that.
Yeah. One of the things I'll often tell clients when they share that 10% is actually, and I say this from a very authentic, truthful way, is I actually feel more connected, more closer to them as a result of them trusting me with that vulnerability. And I think, our staff, all of our staff that work with our clients would actually say that.
Well, and many times at the workshop, and we are hearing men's stories, it is very common for a man to say, I have never told anybody this before, and then they share that part of their story. And what I want them to understand, and I often say it out loud, is this is such a sacred space. When someone has the courage to be able to share something that they've never shared before, there's a holiness to that. It's kind of those take off your shoes Moses moments where in this holy space we need to acknowledge the courage that it took for that person to share it and the grace that abounds in that moment. And it does change people's lives when they find that place where they can begin to get honest about all of their story.
Yeah. It is extremely valuable, and it's a privilege to be on the end of that, to be able to see that someone has taken that courage to be vulnerable with you and to really validate that person for taking that step, I think is a part of what we experience in that Men of Valor workshop group experiences. Guys learn maybe for the first time that, gosh, these other guys are affirming me for sharing something I've never shared before.
Mm-hmm. One thing we're kind of talking about groups, and we recognize that there are different kinds of groups. So here at Faithful and True, we do lead professional process groups that people can participate in, but we also know that there are a lot of peer-led groups, maybe groups that go through a workbook or they watch a video series. And it is especially important in those groups that are maybe not led by a professional that there is a commitment to safety in that. And part of that is confidentiality. Prior to the workshop starting, we take some time to talk about confidentiality because the confidentiality of the group is essential for safety. And I've heard many stories of groups that have basically imploded or exploded because someone didn't take confidentiality seriously and something that was said in group was repeated outside. And so therefore, if you're looking for a group, whether it's led by someone professionally or it's a peer-led group, one of the things that you're going to want to be evaluating is the safety of the group, because something that can set us back in our recovery is when we trust in a group and we discover that they didn't hold our information in confidence and now other people have something that we intended just for the group.
Yeah. Thanks, Greg. When we wrap up this part of it, I guess the one thing I would just really encourage our listeners is, I think developing that safe community is one of the primary things in terms of this whole recovery process. Just looking at research for guys who have, maintained long sobriety, they all rate safe community as the number one thing in the process of their recovery process. And so just really encouraging both, guys who are, in the process of recovery from addiction, but also spouses, how important this aspect of community and finding a safe group is for this whole process as they go through these 3 stages of recovery.
Right. And I often hear both men and women, the husbands, the spouses, talk about how difficult it was to find community. So we don't want to ever make it sound like this is an easy or simple thing, that there is a complexity to finding this safe community, and it is worth it. If it doesn't work the first time, don't give up, just continue. I often tell men that recovery is a team sport and nobody recovers alone. And so if your expectation is you're going to recover by yourself, you're not going to be successful. At some point, there's a role that community plays that is essential and foundational to transformation. And the other piece is God created us for community. It's part of our DNA. And if we're living outside of community, we're living outside of God's intention for our lives. The next thing that is a part of this is the importance of telling the complete truth. We're talking about the stages that couples go through, and in this stage 1, where there's so much chaos, where things are shifting and changing, it is important that at some point there's an intentional effort to share the truth, and we call this full disclosure.
Yeah. This is. The importance of this. There's so many reasons why this is an important process for a couple to go through. I think for the spouse, why it's so important for her is oftentimes, with discovery, her sense of reality has just been altered. Mm-hmm. What she thought to be true is no longer true, and so this is an opportunity for a husband to a certain degree to be able to say, hey, to bring a sense of reality back in terms of what was been altered through discovery.
Absolutely.
And the other thing in terms for the man or the husband, they have the opportunity to truly offer up in an intentional way rather than having, the spouse find information. They get to intentionally offer information about their story to their spouse, and it provides the opportunity, if the spouse so chooses to do so after the disclosure, to choose him anyway.
Right.
Even after what she's heard, and that goes right up against that belief we just talked about a moment ago, that if you really knew me, you wouldn't accept me and love me, right?
Yeah. And just for our listeners to know that there are plans for us to do a podcast, probably a couple of podcasts on this idea of full disclosure, because we do see it as such a significant part of a couple moving forward. The other thing that we would add in this is that as a couple in these early days, it's going to be important for you to evaluate, and you're going to need some help to be able to do this, but to evaluate the toxicity of the coupleship. You know, when the life explodes, when these secrets come out, it can create all kinds of chaos. And in that chaotic environment, there can be a lot of hurt that is expressed maybe intentionally or unintentionally. And so the couple's going to need some help to see if staying together in this moment is the best thing. And so that's why here at Faithful and True, we do talk about the importance of redemptive separation. And that's another thing that in a couple of weeks, we're going to be able to have another podcast about that. So we want you to understand that we see these issues as significant. We're coming out of time today, but we also want you to know we're going to continue this conversation in the future about both full disclosure and redemptive separation.
All right. If we want, I think one of the next things we could talk about, Greg, is in that early stage of recovery here is how to have safe conversations, because like you said, there's so much chaos and oftentimes a lot of volatility here early on that oftentimes we can, conversations can really become destructive really quickly.
Right. And really, it's about creating ground rules of how we're going to engage the topic. And for a lot of couples early on, there's so much pain and chaos. One of the ground rules may be we only have certain conversations with our therapist, that with a safe witness in our midst and that can help us negotiate this. In the early days, we may not have the capacity to have a safe conversation. We're going to need help to do that.
That's right. So some of the things that we in addition to what you just said, is things that we have couples really think about here early on. One of them is we know that when couples have interactions, and this is from some of John Gottman's research, that action and either one of us gets to the place where we're so triggered or physiologically reactive that our heart rate gets it to be about 100 beats per minute. That front part of the brain that has to do with processing and empathy and problem solving kind of goes, offline. And so we often, help couples start to develop, the practice of taking timeouts, taking breaks. And then, later on is being able to introduce them to things like the iceberg model that allows a couple to be able to, take a break, but and develop a way of being able to communicate what just happened to my spouse in a safe way where I'm able to do it from a place of integrity where I walk away feeling good about how I responded to that, to my spouse.
Well, Jim, as usual, we could go another half hour once we get you and Greg together, but we have run out of time for today. But we want to thank you sincerely for coming on the podcast again today.
Yeah, thanks, Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Randy. You and I, Greg, we could go for hours on this. It just seemed like we just got on the phone.
That's exactly right. Well, we may have to introduce the thought of having part 3 of this subject matter, but we thank you sincerely for your time today. We'd like to thank all of our viewers and listeners for joining us today on the Faithful and True podcast. If you have enjoyed the show, please like us on YouTube, and you can also like us if you're listening to the audio version of this podcast. Until we join you again next week, we want to thank you for your time. We hope that our message has been beneficial to you. We hope that this coming week is a week for you that's filled with many blessings and great vision.